Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Wool Maven. It's Kathy. And on today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about jargon. And by that, I mean specific words that people throw around. And if you don't know what they're talking about, it's pretty confusing. And now that I think about it, I just remembered another one. Got to write it down. The jargon we're going to talk about today is going to be specifically related to fiber. There's more specific names for like parts of your spinning wheel and all that kind of stuff. We're not going there today. It's just going to be more about when people talk about the fiber they have or describing what they're trying to do with it. It's more of that sort of thing. Before we get going today, if you haven't signed up for my free mini course, I would love to have you take it. Head on over to woolmaven.com/free. And it's a 7-video mini course that will take you from, to be honest, not being able to do much of anything with your spinning and with your wheel, because everybody starts somewhere. We all start there. So start with very beginner, probably very frustrated, and take you up to getting your yarn to hold together. So sign up for the course. Let me know what you think. It's woolmaven.com/free. The first thing we're going to talk about is you hear the phrase roving. Okay, roving is honestly a little bit more of a confusing term. What it is it looks like honestly, to me, it looks like somebody took cotton candy and kind of stretched it out into a little bit more of a rope. So it's a bit of a swirly, it's well separated fibers, but they're not super well lined up. Roving, technically speaking, comes off of cards and it should be ready to spin. So it has already been washed. If it's going to be dyed, it's probably dyed already. So once you get your roving, it should be good to go. And roving specifically, when we're in the technical term, means that it came off of cards. The reason I tell you that is people tend to use the term roving to mean any ready to spin fiber prep that's, I would say, in skinnier pieces. That's not strictly speaking the case, because depending on how the fiber was run through the mill or how the people prepared it at home, then that determines on what it's actually called. But most people throw the word roving around almost like you'd throw the word cow around. So people commonly use confusing terms, and roving is a big one there. So if it's not roving that you probably have, which once again came off of cards, you probably have comb top. Comb top, as you may have guessed, started out with cards, but then generally because most fleeces would need carded first, and then it's run through an additional step that combs it, hence the name comb top, and further pulls out the rest of any little bits in there, any shorter fibers. So comb top is much more consistent and will have much more likely to have similar length fibers in there. So if it says specifically comb top, then it came off of combs. If it says roving, sometimes people use those interchangeably, but roving itself is actually a little bit more difficult to find. Chances are, if what you're looking for says roving, chances are it's comb top. And people are just using the term roving generically. But anyway, roving off of cards, comb top off of combs. The vast majority of what you're going to be able to get commercially is comb top. So if you're ordering from like a wool supplier, chances are it's not all comb top, but most of it is. The next one is what I've been speaking of is combs versus cards. Combs look like, if you think of a hair pick, just teeth that you pull the wool through, and that gets you a very smooth, all the fibers in alignment wool preparation. And most times you'd see people using two combs. One would be held stationary or would be clamped down, and the other one is your moving comb. And there's different versions of that, but that's the basic idea. But it's the kind of the spikes in the comb, for lack of a better term, look like nails. So if you see wooden handle with nails sticking out of it. That's more of what you've got in the way of combs. A card was going to look more like a dog brush. It's a flat wooden paddle with, honestly, it looks like little bent metal teeth sticking out of it. The cards are measured by how many teeth they have per inch, and it's anywhere from like 120 to, I thought, 56. And mine is a 72. So it's a lot of those little bent wires in one little area there. And what the cards do is they fluff fiber. They just take because straight off the sheep, the wool is kind of packed together, not stuck together, but kind of packed together. So before you spin it, you want to like fluff it up and loosen it up. And that's what the cards do, is they just separate it out. And there's a variety pack of cards. You can have the hand carders, which is what I just described, like the paddle. There's different types of those. There's a drum carder, there's a flick carder, but the basic idea is all cards open up the fibers into more of a fluff so that it's separated out and looks like cotton candy, and then you can spin it more easily. Okay, now we move into the difference between, well, not true. We'll start with micron and staple length. Staple length is the individual length of the wool fibers. So some sheep have a shorter staple length, some sheep have a very, very long staple length, and some sheep have parts that are long and parts that are short. So if you think of it, it's very much so like dogs. Some dogs have a short coat, some dogs have a long coat. Very, very, very similar to that. So staple length is the length of the average wool fiber for what that sheep grows. Microns is how you describe the thickness of the fiber itself. If it's a finer fiber, then it will have a lower number. And if it's a coarser fiber, it will have a higher number. And it's all a range. It goes anywhere from, I thought, rabbits in the 12 to 14 range. Anything under 23 is considered fine. Anything under 30 is considered next to the skin soft. And then you get up into more of the wools that are more all about durability, and they get into the 30s, sometimes even the 40s. So there's your range. But micron means how thick or thin the individual fiber is. Then the other thing about the fiber is crimp. And what crimp means is the waviness of the fiber itself. And generally speaking, the wavier the fiber is, the finer it is. So something like a merino is going to have lots and lots of kinks down the staple length, and something like a long wool, like a Teeswater or Wensleydale, is going to have, it doesn't really have kinks, it has more like waves. And the reason crimp is important is, especially if you're new, a crimpier wool kind of helps things hold together. It almost acts a little bit like Velcro. And I know at least when I was getting started, one of the biggest problems I had was I would start spinning and it's almost like the wheel would steal the fiber from me. I couldn't get anything to hold together. So a little bit crimpier of a wool, it kind of sticks together on its own and helps you out with that a lot. Okay, then the next thing we're going to go to, and I talked about it a touch, is generally, and these are broad categories, the wool sheep are sorted off into, once again, broadly speaking, long wool, medium wool, fine wool, and then there's a down and then a double coated. And depending on who you listen to, I thought some people had more like 6 categories, but it doesn't matter either way. The idea is, very broadly speaking, what is the fiber like? So a long wool, as I'm sure you've guessed, is very long individual fibers, probably in the 6 to 14 inches of growth per year. Now, most of those long wools would be shorn twice a year. Shearing is what you call when you cut the sheep's hair or cut the sheep's wool. And so most of those fibers would be more in the 6 to 8 inch range. But if you got a full year's worth of growth, it would be anywhere from, I'd say low end would be 6, probably more like 8. And then the really long ones would be more like 12 to 14. So those are, as we mentioned, called long wools, and it's just exactly what it sounds like. And then there's the finer wools, which are the softer wools, and they also tend to be shorter. So you're thinking a fine wool that's, oh, wow, you're not going to get a ton over 3.5 inches. So you'll also notice there's like this big gaping hole in the middle of that description. Well, what if it's not long and it's not one of the shorter, finer ones? Then most people go with the ever popular category of medium holes. And that's exactly what it sounds like: medium length and medium crimp. So the vast majority of sheep that, at least in the United States, that are your normal farm flocks, especially in the eastern part of the United States, which is where we live, those are going to be medium wools. When you get into the range flocks, those are probably finer wools, more like Rambouillet. But anyway, you're just regular, everyday, average sheep. Chances are really, really good. It's a medium wool. Then there's also down breeds. And what makes down breeds special, at least wool wise, is not only does their wool have a decent amount of crimp to it, but the crimp is irregular and it does weird stuff. It's kind of in a spiral. So the reason that's important is that down breeds are kind of infamous for not felting, but that makes them golden for if you would want to use them for a project where you'd really rather it to not felt. Those wools just keep their personality. They're like, you can't keep me down. So anything with poof, just stay lively and stay bouncy and have tons of memory. So, and for clarity, there's another bit of jargon there. Memory just means when you pull a yarn and stretch it out and now let it go, does it go back? And if it bounces back, it has a lot of memory. And if it doesn't really have much stretch and doesn't really have much kind of bounce back, then that's a lower elasticity yarn with very, very little memory. And the reason why that matters is the yarns that are bouncier and have more memory, that's more for like the cuffs on your mittens, a hat where you're going to put it on, and to use it, you have to stretch it out, but then you want it to go and fit nicely. You don't want it to just stretch way out and stay stretched out. Whereas if you want something drapey, a wool with less bounce, less memory will drape very, very nicely. That's where memory comes into play there. And generally speaking, the long wools are very drapey, and the mediums and the finer wools have more memory. If you wanted to make a hat or something like that, a lot of people would choose the lower micron mediums or fine wools because they just have so much memory. And you can stretch out your hat to put it on, and then it'll fit nicely on your head. Then the next thing you hear people talk about is hand. What's the hand of the fiber? And what they mean is, how does it feel? How does it feel? Does it make a nice, soft, knitted up fabric? And I just tend to say knitted because I knit, but crocheted up, woven, whatever. How does it feel when you touch it? Is it crisp? Is there a little bit of like a rustic feel to it, or is it nice and soft? That's what people like, the actual tactile experience of it. When they say hand, they mean what does it actually feel like when you touch it and when you work with it. The next things you're going to hear are woolen and worsted. And very broadly speaking, woolen means fluffy and worsted means more compacted down. So a woolen yarn would be fluffy, have a lot of air in it, and have a lot of bounce. So if you were making a hat that you wanted to have a lot of stretch and memory to it, you'd probably be thinking more like a woolen spun yarn, because that would trap a lot of air in there. It would be nice and light and warm. More jargony stuff here is drafting. And what drafting means is just taking your fiber and pulling it thinner. That's it. So I do a lot of pre-drafting. So I draft out the comb top before I spin it, but drafting just means pulling the fiber so that what you're working with is a thinner amount. And if you're pre-drafting, that means you're doing the drafting before you start spinning. There's also drafting while you're spinning, and that's so you don't get big blobs of fiber going into your wheel at once. So you draft, you pull the fibers apart while you're spinning to make your yarn a little bit thinner. Another term in this, maybe should have gone a little bit sooner, is bats. And what bats are is carded fiber generally off of your drum carder. So when you put a bunch of fiber on your drum carder and now you need to take it off, well, it's a circle on your drum carder, but how do you get it off of there? Well, you split the bat and you pull it off, and it's this big sheet. It looks kind of like a cookie sheet, a fluffy cookie sheet. Reminds me of like pillow stuffing. So how do you use the bat? Well, you can spin from it as is. You can tear off little chunks. You can tear it into strips. You can split it so that it in kind of a zigzag split so that it all stays in one piece. I tend to just tear little thinner strips, but it all depends on what you want. Somewhat circling back to the woolen and worsted is the word semi or semi, usually when people are using it. Semi means partway in between. So what's this have to do with anything? Well, when people say semi, they usually put it on semi-worsted, semi-woolen. And what they mean is that the way the fiber was prepped and the way the yarn is spun aren't the same. So it's not a worsted prep and a worsted spin. It's a woolen prep and a worsted spin or something like that. So it's a mix. It's a somewhere in between kind of thing. And to be honest with you, generally speaking, if you purchase the fiber, you're actually doing a semi worsted or woolen, depending on wherever you're at. So it's very, very common. Just some people will say they are, and other people will just say the woolen or the worsted and leave off the semi. But generally speaking, what most people are doing is somewhere in between the 100% worsted and 100% woolen, which is in that whole range in between there is semi this or that. On to more of what you find when you focus on more like the sheep itself. So what you're going to hear is fleece. Fleece is just the wool taken off the sheep. Sometimes it's skirted, which means they took off the outer, like if you'd lay the fleece out like lay it out flat on your floor, the outer edges are where the scruffy bits are. That's probably where the most of the dirt is. That's where like the scragglier bits are from where they lay down. So generally speaking, the fleece is the whole thing shorn off of the sheep. Skirted means they took off the not so great bits. The little individual sections that the fleece is in are called locks. And when it's a long wool, this is easy to see. It looks like a curlicue or one long wave. In the finer wools, the locks are a little bit more or a little bit less defined. Sometimes the locks have more of a triangular shape, like the fins are that way. So if you hear lock spinning, for instance, what that means is the person who's spinning is, instead of working from roving or comb top, what they are doing is working from the locks itself. So they take one of those ringlets and kind of split the end a little bit so they can spin some of it and either spin the whole thing or do those really awesome art yarns where you see it almost looks like a chain of ringlets hanging. Those are super cool. People are doing a ton of neat stuff with like making those fluffy, almost like a faux fur collar. And so that's the most common place that I can think of where people would use locks. And that just means an individual part of the fleece, not an individual fiber and not the whole fleece. Just an easy piece that if you'd reach down and pick it out, it comes out as a lock. Okay, what does a raw fleece mean? Or raw fiber? That means it hasn't been washed. It's just like it came off the sheep. Most of what you would be able to get a hold of has been washed. Everything you're going to get, or not true everything. The vast majority of what you're going to be able to get, especially if you order it from one of the wool suppliers, that's all going to be washed and ready to spin. Raw means it has all the dirt and everything else in it from just like it was on the sheep or the alpaca or whatever the case may be. And then what is lanolin? Lanolin is, it's called the grease in a fleece, and it feels it. It feels greasy. Strictly speaking, it's more of a wax, but that is what you are washing out in addition to dirt. So if you get a raw fleece and you would put it in water, just normal water, the water will turn dirty. And that's just, as you may have guessed, dirt, because sheep are animals that are out and about all year. So there's going to be some dirt there. But the lanolin will still be in the fibers. And some people like to spin with the lanolin in. Most folks would probably be washing that out. And that's when you hear the term scouring, which means you use really hot water and detergent, and that removes what people are calling the grease, which is the lanolin. It's the same lanolin that you hear about in cosmetics. And then the final thing that I want to mention, I actually just did a video about it, is you hear the term VM. And what on earth is VM? And the hilarious part, okay, I'll start. VM is vegetable matter. And it can be anything from hay bits. It could be little bits of like something from the pasture. It's just a contaminant that it's not poop or like dandruff or anything. It is just little bits and pieces of various plants that the sheep ends up basically wearing all year because they're out and about in the pasture, and that's just normal sheep stuff. The funny part is how often you hear, especially when people are looking to buy raw fleeces or straight from the farm fleeces, how often you hear people question, is there a lot of VM? There might be a little VM. Is there any VM? People just go on and on about VM, but unless you know what on earth they're talking about, right, then that really doesn't help you a ton. But VM is just vegetable matter. And the reason why people are a little worried about it is it generally doesn't come out well, especially the little bits, like the bigger pieces. Well, those are easy. You can just pick them right off. But the little bits, those are harder to get out. And especially if your prep plans are just spinning as is, the VM still going to be there because you didn't take it out with anything. If you card your fiber, that takes out some, but honestly, not all of it. Not all of it. And then if you comb, that will take out most of it. But still, anytime, I've even gotten little bits of VM in comb top that I've purchased. So a fleece can go through the complete process, washed, carded, combed, and shipped out to me, and still have a little bit of hay hanging out in there somewhere. And true, it's teeny little bits. It's teeny little bits, but I do occasionally find it. But the more processed your fleece is, so the more steps it goes through, the less likely it is to have any little shorter fibers and any contaminants of the plants called, as I mentioned, VM. That was the end of my list, but we'll add second cuts. The other thing that if you're buying fleeces from the farm, you might hear of is second cuts. And what this means is when the shearer was shearing, the shearing works just like if you've seen the barber use clippers on somebody with a really short haircut, how you run the clippers along the skin, cuts off the hair really, really close to the skin. Well, that is what the shearers are doing. They cut the wool really, really close to the skin. Well, occasionally, and it's usually, to be honest with you, the sheep moves because some of the sheep are not super cooperative. So when the sheep moves, then the clippers move away from the skin. So instead of cutting the fleece nice and short, they leave sometimes a little strip, or it looks like a little bump, and most shearers will go back through and just take off that little bump. So that's called a second cut because, as you may have guessed from the name, they went over that spot again. And it's just really, really short bits. So if you were felting or maybe even carding, you could put those in, but most people would pull those out because they don't want them. If your fleece is well skirted, which once again means all the not great spinnable stuff has been pulled off. You're just left with the really, really nice stuff. So if your fleece has been well skirted, most of those second cuts, if there were any to begin with, are probably not going to make it to you, right? They're going to be pulled off. But second cuts can happen. It's not a huge deal. And that's about it. I think we're there. And once again, this was just fiber related jargon and a little bit of sheep stuff, which I always like. There's still quite a bit of jargon if you're new related to the actual equipment. Maybe we'll go over that another day. That's where we're going to end it for today. So thank you so much for tuning in. I always appreciate your time. If you have any questions or comments, I do have an email. You can reach me at woolmavenhandspinning@gmail.com. That's WOOLMAVENHANDSPINNING@gmail.com, as I mentioned. And my name's Kathy. Or you can join me on our Facebook group, which is Hand Spinning Yarn with a Spinning Wheel. And if you're new, once again, please check out my free mini course. As I mentioned, it's free and it'll get you going. If you don't spend tons and tons of time frustrated when just seriously, it's probably just a little thing. It's a little thing that you're probably misunderstanding, or because it's you and you're right there, you don't see it for yourself. But I've got some ways to practice before you even start the actual spinning part of the course that will help you get going and it make your life so much easier. So if you haven't taken the mini course, I'd love to have you take it. It's at woolmaven.com/free. Sign up, check it out, and then send me your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for tuning in. Have a super day.